By sunrise, my father was in the ground. By sunset, my brother had legally taken everything my father ever promised would be mine. One night, that's all it took. The last time I held my father's hand in the ICU, he couldn't even lift a cup of water. 2 days later, my brother walked out of the county office in Topeka, holding a fresh deed, a brand new will, and a look that said he'd slipped through a door that was never meant to open for him. He told me Dad signed it before the end. The house, the land, it's all mine now. But I had been there. I'd watched my father fade in and out, clinging to half-finished sentences, squeezing my hand as if time were pulling him away mid-word. So let me ask you this. How does a dying man too weak to hold a pen somehow sign away a lifetime of promises overnight? Stay with me. A little further into this story, you'll be in my father's workshop as I pry up a floorboard and find the steel safe he never told either of us about. As the story deepens, you'll stand in the courtroom with me when the handwriting expert reveals what my brother actually forged. And when we reach the final stretch, you'll hear the line from my father's hidden letter that cut deeper than the betrayal itself. This isn't a story about revenge, it's about how far a man will go to protect what's right, without losing himself in the process. And for me, it all began the moment I turned into that old driveway when something small, something ordinary told me my world had already shifted. The mailbox was the first thing that felt wrong. The red flag stood crooked against the winter air, stiff with frost, as if someone had lifted it with a tired hand and walked away without a second look. Dad never left it like that. He believed small things revealed a man's character, and he lived by that rule long before I was old enough to understand it. I parked beside the cottonwoods that framed the front yard and let the engine settle into silence. The house looked older from this angle, hunched against the wind that rolled across the Kansas fields. The chipped red siding, the porch steps that creaked in the cold, the familiar smell of timber and soil that drifted in every time the land thawed or froze. For a moment I expected to see Dad in the window, one hand lifting the curtain the way he always did when he heard tires on gravel. The porch light was still on even though it was mid-morning. He would have scolded me for wasting electricity if I had left it burning like that. Dad treated every light switch like it came straight out of his paycheck. I found myself reaching automatically for the mailbox lid. A thin envelope had slipped halfway out and was hanging there like it wanted to fall. I slid it back in. A small act, but it steadied me. I walked toward the house and noticed the new deadbolt. It was silver and clean and did not match the weathered doorknob I grew up with. Dad would never have replaced it without mentioning it to me. He was a man who talked things through when they mattered, and this door had mattered to him. He once told me a home begins the moment you turn the key. Seeing a keyhole I did not recognize felt like a stranger had taken up space where he used to stand. Cliff's Silverado sat angled across the yard wheels, half-turned as if he had arrived in a hurry and stayed tense. The truck had always been his way of announcing himself. Loud, oversized, the kind of vehicle meant to make up for something a man could not quite admit out loud. I paused at the bottom of the steps. The wind cut across the field and hit the porch, carrying the dry smell of hay from the old barn. Somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of roofing slapped against metal. The sound echoed along the siding like a reminder that the place was aging and Dad was no longer here to patch things up. The front door opened. Cliff stepped out and leaned into the frame, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion a man does not earn overnight. He stared at me for a moment as if trying to decide how this conversation should begin. Then he lifted a folded packet between us. He said I was too late. He said Dad had signed a new will. The words came out flat. Not angry, not triumphant, just tired. I watched his jaw tighten as if saying them hurt more than he wanted to admit. I asked when. My voice came out steady even though something inside me had already shifted. Cliff looked past my shoulder toward the field, searching for something to anchor himself to, then mumbled that Dad signed before the end, and that he had filed everything at the recorder's office before sunrise. His breathing was uneven. The hand holding the packet trembled slightly. In another circumstance, I might have asked if he was all right. Today I knew better. I told him Dad could barely lift a glass of water in ICU. I told him he drifted in and out, saying only half sentences, holding my hand, like he was afraid he would lose the words he still needed to say. Cliff would not meet my eyes. He said Dad found the strength when it mattered. The way he said it made something cold gather in my chest. We stood there, the two of us, on a porch that once felt too small for our arguments as boys. Now it felt too large for what had gone missing between us. I noticed Cliff's boots shifting on the plank, the way he scraped his heel like a man trying to shake off guilt. He whispered that I should let things be, that he had a lot to handle and could not afford trouble right now. I did not answer. A crow landed on the fence post near the barn and let out a harsh call that broke the silence. Cliff flinched. I did not. Years working highways in midwinter teach you to stay still when everything around you starts pushing. I stepped away from him, letting my hand brush the porch railing. One of the boards was loose. I pressed it back into place out of habit. Dad would have done the same. He taught me that a man should leave things better than he found them. Even now, standing on a porch that might no longer belong to me, the reflex stayed. I remembered one evening on this same porch long before Dad got sick. He told me the house would be mine. He said I had a way of listening to the land, that I felt things Cliff never paid attention to. Back then I laughed it off. I did not understand how much weight a promise like that could carry. Not until the day I needed something solid to lean on. Not until the day I buried him. I walked toward the yard, listening to the gravel shift under my boots. The air tasted metallic and cold. Cliff stayed on the porch, shoulders heavy, the packet hanging at his side like a verdict already delivered. I wanted to ask him why he was doing this, whether he truly believed Dad wanted him to have the house or if he simply needed something he could not earn on his own. But the words did not come. Instead, I stopped near the cottonwoods and looked back at the house. The curtains were closed tight. The porch light flickered against the morning sun. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath. It reminded me of the moment right before a storm breaks across the plains, silent but charged, waiting. I knew then the truth was tangled deeper than a new lock or a rushed filing at the courthouse. Something had been set in motion long before I arrived. Something that did not fit with the man my father was, or the way he lived his life. The February wind blew against my back as I headed toward my truck. It carried a sound from the woods behind the house, a long creak from the old trees shifting in the cold. It almost felt like the land itself was trying to tell me something. I paused, listening, though I could not say what I hoped to hear. I opened the truck door and rested my hand on the frame. My breath came slower now, the way it does when a hard truth begins to take shape. The promise Dad made me, the one steady thing I had left after he was gone, might have been undone overnight. Yet beneath the shock and the hurt, something else stirred, a quiet certainty, a resolve I had felt only a few times in my life. Whatever happened here was not finished with me, and I was not finished with it. The road out of town looked washed out in the morning light, a long stretch of pale asphalt cutting through fields the color of winter bone. I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the worn fabric of the seat, letting the heater fight the cold that seeped through every crack of the old truck. The silence inside the cab felt heavier than the wind outside, and every mile that pulled me farther from the house made the questions in my head settle deeper. A memory drifted in without warning. Dad sitting at the kitchen table years ago, paperwork spread in front of him, glasses pushed low on his nose. He had traced a finger over a deed with a kind of quiet pride. He said land was the one thing a man could leave behind that never lied. I held on to that memory as the signs for Topeka grew closer. Carlson's office stood at the end of a short strip of older buildings, brick, faded from decades of Kansas sun. I pushed open the glass door and stepped into a room that smelled like paper dust and stale heat. The receptionist looked up from her desk, polite but cautious, as if she had been expecting someone from our family and hoping she was wrong. When I asked about Carlson, she folded her hands and said he had retired. The words came out steady, but her eyes darted toward the closed office door as though it still held pieces of him. She added that he left for Florida the same week Dad passed. I watched her tug at the edge of her sweater, a small nervous motion she tried to hide. I asked if anyone had seen him after Dad went into the hospital. She hesitated. Then she mentioned Cliff said he had come by in a rush with a thick envelope days before Harold died. The way she said thick carried weight. I waited for her to add more, but she pressed her lips together and looked at her screen. I thanked her softly, the way Dad taught me to show respect even when the answers hurt more than the sunts. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I leaned against the truck door and unfolded the photocopy Cliff had given me earlier. Dad's signature stared back at me. Same letters, same familiar loops, but something felt off. The strokes were too smooth, too strong. Dad could barely sign his name before the nurses steadied his hand. My chest tightened. I traced the edge of the paper, then folded it slowly as though the truth needed gentler handling than anger could offer. I started the truck and headed back along the old road toward our part of town. The fields outside Topeka were empty, the stalks from last season still standing like brittle reminders of a harvest long gone. Every now and then I caught myself imagining Dad in the passenger seat, turning down the radio, telling me to think before I spoke to my brother. He always tried to teach us that. Think first, act second, regret last. I stopped at the general store for a cheap cup of coffee. The first sip tasted burnt the way small-town coffee often does, but the warmth steadied my hands. Dorothy Hayes was standing near the door with a grocery bag, her coat buttoned wrong. Something she often did when her mind was elsewhere. She greeted me with a soft touch on the arm and told me she was sorry for my loss. I asked if she had seen anything unusual around the house last week. Dorothy's gaze shifted toward the floor. She said she had been up late with trouble sleeping, and she noticed Cliff leaving our driveway around 2 in the morning carrying what looked like file folders and a metal box. She said he moved like a man trying not to make noise, which in her experience usually meant he had something on his conscience. I thanked her and stepped outside, the bell above the door chiming steadily as it closed. The sky had darkened with a thin layer of cloud. I drove the last stretch back to the property without turning on the radio. The quiet helped me think. I entered the workshop through the side door the same way Dad had walked in every morning of his life. The scent inside wrapped around me. Motor oil, sawdust, dried earth on old work boots, and the faint sour trace of cold coffee. Smells that had soaked into the boards so deeply that even fresh paint would not erase them. For a moment my vision blurred and I reached out with a hand to steady myself on the frame of the door. The drawer where Dad kept the old will sat open and empty. He had always left tools out and papers stacked in uneven piles. He never minded a little clutter. Seeing that drawer wiped clean felt unnatural in a way I could not shake. I crouched down and ran my fingers across the bottom. No dust, nothing. Someone had scrubbed it bare. I looked under the desk and saw the drag marks cutting sharp lines into the old oak floor. Patterns like that only came from something heavy being pulled out in a hurry. A safe, maybe. or a metal box. I followed the marks with my fingertips, feeling the rough edges catch my skin. The cold of the wood worked its way into my bones, a memory flickered. Dad kneeling beside me when I was 10, showing me how to sand a plank until it felt smooth under my palm. He told me wood remembers the hands that shape it. Standing there in the workshop, touching those scars in the floor, I believed him. I moved to the workbench, tracing the shallow groove where Dad had carved his initials decades ago. My hand lingered there. It was a gesture so small anyone else would have missed its meaning. I found myself wishing he had left one more message carved somewhere, one more sign pointing me in the right direction. A cold draft slipped through the window frame. Tools hanging on the wall rattled softly as if stirred by something unseen. A wrench rocked on its hook, not enough to fall, but enough to catch my eye. I stepped closer and noticed a faint streak of dried mud near the back door, the kind of mud that comes from the river road after a winter thaw. Cliff had no reason to be near the river that week. Dad did not either. The questions pressed against me. They felt heavier now, more real. I walked back outside and let the air cool the heat rising under my collar. The house sat quiet behind me. The trees shook gently in the wind. From somewhere near the edge of the woods came a soft creak, long and slow, almost like the land exhaling. I stood there for a long moment with my breath fogging the air, watching it dissolve into the gray sky. The ground felt different beneath my boots, as if something buried had shifted. Whatever happened in that workshop had not begun with a forged signature or a new lock on the front door. It had been set in motion long before Dad took his last breath, tucked in dark corners and hidden drawers, waiting for the right night to be pulled into the open. I took one last look at the house as a crow flew overhead, its wings cutting a black line across the pale sky. Then I walked toward the truck, the cold following close behind, steady and unyielding like a truth that refused to stay buried. The cold followed me all the way back to the truck, settling around my shoulders like a weight I could not shake. I sat behind the wheel for a moment with the engine off, listening to the wind slide across the fields, carrying the dry rustle of bare branches and the faint rattle of the old barn door. Something in the workshop had shifted the ground under my feet, and no matter how long I stared through the windshield, the feeling only grew sharper. I knew I would need to return once Cliff was gone for the day. Whatever he had dragged across those floorboards was not something Dad meant for anyone to touch without understanding the cost. I waited until mid-afternoon, when I knew Cliff would be at the dealership in Oklahoma City trying to sell trucks to strangers with that forced confidence he wore like a too-big jacket. The drive back to Dad's house felt quieter than the first time. There was a kind of resolve settling inside me, steady as a slow breath in cold air. The sun hung low when I pulled up beside the workshop. The light was muted, filtered through thin clouds, turning the yard into a wash of gray and gold. I stepped out and closed the truck door gently, out of habit more than caution. The key Dad had given me years ago sat warm against my palm. He had slipped it to me after Mom died, saying he did not trust himself to keep track of things anymore. Just in case he ever forgot his own, he said. I remember the way he looked at the ground as he handed it to me, like the gesture meant more than he could explain. The back door opened with a soft click, the old hinges complaining under the weight of time. Inside, the air held the same familiar scent of motor oil and sawdust. But now there was something else, too. A tension that made the room feel smaller. I crossed the concrete floor slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. Dust hung in the air, catching the glow from the single overhead bulb. The desk sat exactly where it always had, heavy and rooted like a stubborn tree. I knelt beside it and ran my hand along the drag marks again, feeling their depth, the sharp edges where the wood had splintered. Dad had built this desk when I was young, I remembered standing beside him, passing him nails from a coffee tin while he hammered the friche together. He told me wood was honest. It only broke when forced. Looking at the gouges now, I knew something had been forced. I slid my hand under the desk and pressed along the underside until I found the loose board I had always known was there. When I was a kid, I used to hide baseball cards in that tiny pocket of space, thinking Dad would never find them. He always did. But he never said a word, letting me believe I still had secrets worth keeping. The board lifted with a soft groan. Beneath it, wedged tightly between the floor joists, sat a steel safe covered in a thick layer of dust. The metal was cold against my fingertips. Vietnam era by the looks of it, the kind of thing a man kept not for money, but for something he considered heavier. I leaned down, brushing away the grime with the edge of my sleeve, and felt a strange calm settle in my chest. I went to the small cabinet near the wall where Mom kept her sewing supplies long ago. Her old tin box still sat there, dented at the corner from the time she dropped it. I opened it slowly. Inside were buttons, tangled thread, and a few faded envelopes. Tucked near the bottom was a small silver key labeled with a single letter in Mom's handwriting. An H written with the same careful stroke she used on Christmas tags and school notes. The key slid into the lock perfectly. I felt the mechanism shift with a quiet click. When the door creaked open, the sound felt louder than it should have, like the safe had been waiting too long to breathe. Inside lay a stack of documents tied with twine. The top one was the original will dated 10 years earlier, with a notary stamp still crisp in the corner. My name appeared where I remembered Dad telling me it would. The house and the land left to me. A note in his handwriting rested on top of the papers. He had written only a few words. Protecting the responsible son. Reading it made my throat tighten. Beneath the will were folders labeled in Dad's steady block letters. One held land trust papers from 8 years ago. The trust placed 120 acres of timber into protection, naming me as sole beneficiary. The details were exact and binding. I read the signatures twice, letting the reality of it sink in. Dad had locked away most of the land long before Cliff ever stepped into that hospital room. Another envelope, thin and sealed, lay at the bottom. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page written in Dad's rough handwriting. The lines wavered slightly, but the words carried the weight of a man who had already accepted truths he could not speak out loud. He wrote that Cliff was in deep trouble with loan sharks out of Joplin. He said only I would protect the land. If Cliff ever tried to sell anything, I was to show the trust and stop him. A smaller file rested beneath the letter. Papers from a lender in Missouri. Payment demands. Threatening notices. A balance circled in red ink. $127,000. Final notice less than 60 days away. I felt the bottom drop out of me. Cliff's midnight visit, the rush to file the deed, the sudden claim about the new will, it all clicked together with a clarity that made my skin prickle. I sat back on my heels, holding the papers lightly so they would not shake. The room felt colder than before, the draft slipping along the floor and curling around my ankles. I could hear the workshop settling, the creak of beams, the faint tick of metal cooling. It sounded like the house was exhaling, letting go of a secret it had kept too long. I placed everything back in order, folding the letter with care and returning the trust documents to the safe. My hands lingered a moment on the metal door before closing it. The weight of the safe felt heavier now, not just with paper, but with the truth I had finally seen clearly. Standing, I pressed the floorboard back into place and brushed the dust from my palms. The workshop seemed different, as if the shadows had shifted. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Faint evening light filtered through, catching motes of dust in a soft, quiet shimmer. I walked toward the door, slowly listening to the scrape of my boots on the concrete. When I stepped outside, the cold bit at my face and the yard stretched out before me in a muted wash of blue and gray. The trees stood still, their branches etched against the fading sky. Somewhere beyond them, a single crow called out, its voice thin and distant. I stood there with the key in my hand, watching the last light slip behind the timber. The quiet settled around me again, not empty this time, but waiting. But the phone buzzed against my palm while I was still standing in the yard. Cold air wrapped around me and the last light draining out of the sky. I glanced at the screen. Topeka area code, hospital number, St. Luke's. I answered and tried to keep my voice steady. The woman on the line sounded practiced and polite. Records department. She said my request for access to Harold Rowland's chart had been approved. I could come by in the morning. Her words were efficient, trimmed of sympathy, but there was a pause at the end that felt almost human. I thanked her and ended the call. That night I slept badly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's hand on the sheets, the safe under the floor, Cliff's truck blocking the drive. I woke before sunrise, watched the ceiling for a while, then got dressed and drove toward Topeka with the radio off. The sky in the east was just a faint pale smear over dark fields, and the truck's headlights cut through patches of lingering fog. St. Luke's looked the same as it had the week Dad died. Same white facade, same glass doors that whispered open before you touched them. The smell of disinfectant and cafeteria coffee hit me as soon as I walked in. I followed the signs toward medical records past the waiting area where families sat, hunched in chairs, hands wrapped around styrofoam cups like they were holding on to something more than heat. In the small office, a woman in scrubs printed out the chart for me. She slid the folder across the counter and asked if I had any questions. Her eyes softened when she saw my name on the cover. I told her I might, but not yet. She nodded and went back to her computer with a kind of quiet understanding that did not need words. I sat in a chair by the window and flipped through the chart. Lab results, progress notes, nursing entries written in rushed handwriting, times and vital signs, and the steady march toward the end. Most of it was what I expected. Then I found the page with the pain medication orders. There was a dosing change added 2 nights before Dad passed. Higher amounts, new intervals, an add-on order from a late hour. I looked for the physician's signature. The space was filled with a name, but when I checked the electronic note printed at the bottom of the page, there was a line that said, "Order not found in system." A discrepancy. Not a smoking gun, just a fracture in the paperwork big enough for doubt to slip through. I asked the clerk if there was someone from the ICU who had been on duty that week. She pointed me toward a desolate hallway lined with old photos of donors. At the end of it, on a worn bench, a woman in blue scrubs sat tying her shoe. Her badge read Maria Allen, night shift nurse. I introduced myself and told her Harold was my father. She nodded slowly and said she remembered him. The quiet one, she called him, who always thanked the nurses even when he could barely breathe. I asked if she remembered my brother. She looked past me toward the elevators as if replaying old footage in her mind. Then she said she had seen Cliff late one evening 2 nights before Dad died. He had come up the hall with a paper bag and a folder under his arm, moving fast, pushing into Dad's room before she could finish checking his visitor badge. She said the door had been half closed. She heard raised voices, not yelling, but tense the way families get when they are trying not to disturb the ward and failing. She heard my father's voice, weak but firm, and my brother's voice breaking at the edges. She had gone to check on another patient, and when she came back, Cliff was standing in the hallway with red eyes and his jaw clenched tight. He walked past her without a word. His hands shook. I thanked her. She hesitated, then told me security might have footage from that night. Hallway cameras only, nothing inside the room, enough to show movement. Not enough to show the heart of it. Down in security, a man with a tired face and a coffee mug stained dark along the rim brought up the video from that date. We watched the gray-scale image on a small screen. Cliff came into frame, shoulders hunched, paper bag in one hand, folder in the other. He paused at the door, then slipped inside. The timestamp on the screen marked 22 minutes before he emerged again, wiping his face with his sleeve. Dad never appeared in the shot. Only his room door, only his son going in and out. The security man asked if I needed a copy. I nodded. He burned the footage to a disk without asking questions. When he handed it over, he said he was sorry for my loss in a quiet way that suggested he had said it countless times, and meant it every time. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The ground glowed faintly under the orange sodium lights. I leaned against my truck and held the disk and the debt file I had taken from the safe one in each hand. The air smelled like exhaust, old rain, and the faint metallic hint of winter. I called Cliff and told him to meet me there. He showed up 15 minutes later, tires squealing a little as he pulled into a space 2 rows away. He got out slowly, shoulders higher than usual, like he expected a blow. I did not move. I let him walk the distance between us. When he reached the front of my truck, he stopped and waited. I could see the strain in his face, the faint tremor in his jaw. I held up the disc and the folder. I said his name, told him I had been to records, that I had seen the chart, that I knew he had been there that night. His gaze dropped to the pavement. The orange light painted deep shadows under his eyes. He asked what I thought he had done. The question came out in a rasp, more wounded than defensive. I said I thought he had gone to Dad with paperwork in his hands and desperation in his chest. I told him I knew about the loan sharks, about Joplin, about the $127,000 he did not have. For a second he did not breathe. Then his shoulders sagged and he leaned back against the hood of my truck as if his legs had given out. The metal creaked under his weight. His hands covered his face. I heard his breath hitch. He said he did not kill him. Over and over at first, then slower. I did not kill him. I was drowning. I begged him to sign, that was all. He kept his voice low as if the walls of St. Luke's might be listening. He told me he brought the new will into the room in that brown folder. He had been told to get Dad's signature before the lenders took the house or anything else. He thought maybe one last time Dad would step in and fix what he had broken. Cliff said he laid the papers in front of him and asked for help, asked for rescue, asked like a boy, not a grown man. Dad had looked at the papers and pushed them back. Told him a man had to own his mistakes. Told him some debts could not be patched with someone else's name. Told him he loved him but he could not sign. Not this, not now. Cliff's voice shook as he recounted it. He said he lost it for a moment, raised his voice, asked if Dad wanted to see him lose everything. Then he saw how tired Dad looked, how every breath cost him. So he gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the folder, and walked out before the nurses came in. I watched him speak, watched his face fold in on itself. This was not the calm, smug brother who had met me on the porch. This was a man with the ground gone beneath him, trying to stand on air. I asked him where Lauren was. He stared past the hospital toward the darkening sky and said she had taken their boy to Tulsa, staying with her sister. She had heard one of the lenders leave a voicemail on his phone, had seen the fear in his face, and decided she would not wait around to see it turn into something worse. The lot was quiet around us except for the occasional squeal of a cart and the hum of a distant train. Cars came and went, headlights sweeping across the asphalt in pale arcs. Neither of us moved. For the first time since this began, I saw Cliff without the armor. No sales pitch, no bravado, no practiced indignation. Just a man who had backed himself into a corner so tight he could not see a way out, except to grab at the only thing he thought left our father's house. I did not forgive him. Not then. The hurt sat too fresh in my chest. But something shifted. The anger that had been a straight, sharp line began to bend, making room for another feeling that did not come easy to me. Pity. Maybe recognition. I let out a long breath. It drifted in the cold air between us, then vanished. The disc in my hand felt heavier than it had a few minutes earlier. So did the folder. I set them on the hood beside him and looked up at the hospital windows glowing square and yellow against the dark. Somewhere up there was the room where Dad had refused one last chance to clean up a mess that was not his. Somewhere up there was the bed where he took that choice with him into the silence. I stood there a little while longer, listening to the soft buzz of the parking lot lights and the faint hum of engines on the road beyond the hospital until the night seemed to fold around us and hold its breath. The hospital lights hummed above us until the cold started to creep through my boots. At some point, I pushed myself off the truck and told Cliff to go home, whatever home meant for him now. He nodded without looking at me, climbed into his Silverado, and drove off with his headlights cutting a brief tunnel through the dark. I sat there a while longer, then turned the key and let the engine carry me back into the night. A week slid by in a blur of gray mornings and long drives between the house and the workshop. Paperwork, phone calls, silent meals at my own kitchen table where Haley watched me with questions she did not quite dare to ask. Cliff stopped answering his phone after the third day. The dealership said he had taken some time off. No one knew where he was, or they decided it was safer to pretend they did not. I found him in Salina after Dorothy mentioned a friend who had seen his truck at a budget motel off the interstate. The kind of place you pull into when you are too tired to keep going but not tired enough to care where you land. The lot was half empty, plastic numbers on the doors, a flickering sign over the office that buzzed against the early evening. His room smelled like stale smoke and old takeout. The curtains were drawn tight even though the sun had not completely fallen. Clothes were piled in the corner. A fast food bag lay open on the small table, fries hardened into pale sticks. The television murmured in the background, some late afternoon talk show trying to sound cheerful for an audience that no longer believed in that sort of thing. Cliff sat on the edge of the bed with his shoulders hunched, fingers twisted together between his knees. He did not look up when I came in. I closed the door quietly and leaned against it. The heater under the window rattled as it pushed lukewarm air into the room. He finally spoke without raising his head. His voice sounded smaller in that cramped space. "If I had told you about the debts when it started, would you have helped me, or would you have just told me I earned it?" He stared at the carpet like the answer might be woven into the pattern. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The truth lodged in my throat. I did not know what I would have done. Maybe I would have tried to help. Maybe I would have told him he had to learn the hard way. Neither answer felt clean enough to offer, so I stayed silent. He gave a humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough, said that was what he figured. That was why he kept his mouth shut until the numbers got bigger than anything he could imagine. Until men from Joplin started calling him by his first name in a way that made his skin crawl. I told him I had seen the debt file, the red circles around the total, the deadlines. He dragged a hand down his face and nodded. He said they had started calling Lauren too before she took the boy and ran to Tulsa. They had not threatened her yet. They did not have to. A certain tone on the other end of the line is enough. Any woman who hears it knows what it means. We sat in that room with the television murmuring about something that did not matter and the faded bedspread pulled tight under Cliff's hands. I could feel the weight of the motel walls pressing in. Men had been breaking inside those rooms for decades, breaking alone, breaking with strangers. My brother was just another one in a long line. I told him he needed to talk to a lawyer. He laughed again, softer this time. Said lawyers cost money and he had already sold everything worth selling except his truck and his pride. He looked around the room like he was taking inventory of nothing. Then he asked the question that cut a little deeper. Do you think Dad would have helped if I had come to him before it got this bad? I looked at the chipped paint on the door, at the scuffed toes of his boots. I imagined Dad sitting at the worn kitchen table, Cliff across from him, papers between them. I pictured the look that would have crossed his face, the mix of disappointment and stubborn love. I said I thought Dad would have tried, but not at the cost of the land, not at the cost of everything he had spent his life building. Cliff nodded slowly as if he had known that already but needed to hear it out loud. His shoulders sagged a little more. I left when the room felt too tight for both of us. In the parking lot, the air smelled like exhaust and fried food from the diner next door. The sky over Salina was low and heavy. I climbed into the truck and pulled back onto the highway, heading north instead of home. Highway 83 unrolled ahead of me in long straight lines through flat winter fields. The kind of road where your thoughts can outrun the truck if you let them. Stubble from last season's crop scratched at the snow in uneven rows. Fence posts leaned under the weight of time. The sun sank behind a layer of clouds, turning the world into a wash of blue and gray. I remembered Dad on summer evenings when we were boys, dragging us back into the yard after another fight. He would set us facing each other, his big hands on our shoulders, and make us shake. He never let go until he felt our fingers tighten for real. Roland boys do not stay enemies, he would say. We figure it out. Back then it sounded like a rule for children. Driving those empty miles, it sounded more like a debt I owed him. The phone rang while I was watching the road disappear under the headlights. Tulsa area code. I answered and heard Lauren's voice on the other end, thin, shaky. She did not waste time on greetings. She said the Joplin men had found her number, that someone had called and asked how her husband was holding up. Said they hoped for his sake he was moving quickly. No threats, not yet. She said the way the man laughed made her feel like someone had opened a window in the middle of the night. She asked me if I was doing anything to stop Cliff from making things worse. She said he was close to the edge, that she knew him well enough to hear it in his voice. I told her I had found him. I told her he was scared, that he was not thinking straight. She said that was exactly what she was afraid of. After we hung up, I pulled into a truck stop, the kind with fluorescent lights buzzing over a row of semis, and a diner that never truly slept. Inside, the coffee tasted even worse than the cup I had grabbed in Topeka, but it was hot and it gave my hands something to do. I sat at a plastic table by the window, watching the highway and the steady movement of taillights sliding past like red ghosts, the safe, the will, the trust, Dad's letter. Cliff's confession in the parking lot, Lauren's voice on the phone. They all sat together in my mind like pieces laid out on one of Dad's old workbenches. I could see the shape of what needed to be done, even if I did not like it. This was no longer just a matter of family arguments and harsh words on a porch. Cliff had crossed from bad decisions into criminal ground the moment he put a forged will in front of me and took a run at stealing the house. If I did nothing, the forged document stood a chance of worming its way through probate. If I pushed too hard, my brother could end up in prison. I sat there with my fingers wrapped around the cooling paper cup and tried to imagine explaining any of this to Dad. I saw him in the workshop, rag in hand, listening quietly while I told him his youngest son had tried to steal from his oldest. I imagined his eyes closing for a long moment, then opening again with that tired, steady look he got when something had to be fixed, whether he wanted to or not. By the time my coffee had gone cold, I knew what I had to do. I could not leave this buried under the rug of family drama. I would have to go to probate court and contest the forged will, lay all of it on the table in front of a judge. At the same time, I would walk a line I had never walked before, fight to protect Dad's wishes in the land, without handing my brother over completely to the system that would crush him. The neon sign outside the diner flickered off and back on again. A truck engine rumbled to life somewhere in the lot. I stood up, tossed the empty cup, and stepped into the cold. The next morning I woke before the alarm. The house was still the kind of quiet that comes before the world remembers its chores. Haley's door was closed. I could hear the faint hum of the heater pushing air through the vents. In the small bedroom I had turned into a makeshift office, the safe documents lay waiting on the desk exactly where I had left them. I sat down and spread them out. The original will edges slightly worn from Dad handling it. The land trust papers black ink and legal language spelling out exactly what he wanted protected. The letter he had left me, his handwriting shaking but clear. Cliff is in deep. Only you will protect this land. If he ever tries to sell, stop him. I slid everything into a sturdy folder and pressed the metal clasp shut. The click sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. I rested my hand on top of the folder for a moment, feeling the slight unevenness of the papers beneath. This was more than just proof. It was a line drawn across the floor between what I could accept and what I could not. In the hallway, a floorboard creaked under my weight as I stood. The sound carried through the still house like a small reminder that every step had weight now. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, glanced once at the framed photo of Dad on the shelf, then stepped outside into the clear, cold morning. Frost clung to the hood of my truck that morning, a thin, white skin that cracked under my fingertip when I brushed it. The folder waited on the passenger seat where I had left it, edge's neat metal clasp catching the first weak light creeping over the horizon. I sat behind the wheel for a while, watching my breath fog the windshield, listening to the engine idle low and steady. Days slid into weeks after that drive to the courthouse with the folder on the seat. Then weeks slid into months. Forms were filed, calls were made. My new attorney, a compact woman named Karen who had grown up in Clay Center and knew the probate judges in Shawnee County by their first names, walked me through each step in short, calm sentences. She had a way of looking at paper that made it seem less like a threat and more like something you could take apart if you were patient enough. We met in her small office above a bank walls lined with case files and dusty law books. Sometimes the sounds of the teller line drifted up through the floor. I laid out Dad's will, the trust documents, the letter, the debt file, the hospital records, the security footage. She lined everything up in order, hands moving with a mechanic's precision. No wasted motions. She said it would take time. She said the court moved at its own pace, slower when you wanted it quick, faster when you hoped for a delay. I nodded and went back to work, back to the house, back to the workshop that still smelled like my father and secrets and oil. While the case inched forward, I split my days between the land and the phone, between fixing sagging boards and answering questions from handwriting experts who asked about how Dad signed his name before his hands started to shake. By the time the hearing date finally arrived, winter had settled in for good. Snow dusted the courthouse steps in Topeka, tamped down where other shoes had passed. I stood at the bottom of the wide stone staircase and took a long breath that tasted like cold and old brick. Karen walked beside me with her slim briefcase swinging against her leg. She told me again what would happen inside, not because I had forgotten, but because sometimes you need to hear the road laid out right before you step onto it. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, wood paneled with a high ceiling and a crucifix of fluorescent lights humming above. A state flag drooped in one corner, its colors dulled by dust. The judge sat on the bench in a worn black robe, silver hair, cropped close eyes that had likely seen every version of family dispute long before ours landed on his docket. Cliff sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a man in a gray suit that looked too sharp for my brother's slumped shoulders. Cliff's hands were folded on the tabletop, knuckles white. He did not look at me when I took my seat. I watched a muscle jump in his jaw, then settle, then jump again. The clerk called the case. The sound of my family name felt strange as it echoed off the wood. Roland Estate. It made Dad feel like a file folder instead of the man who taught me how to change my oil and how to carry myself when the world tried to knock me down. Arguments began. Karen stood and spoke in that even voice of hers, laying out the dates, the documents, the trust that had been signed years before any new will appeared. She pointed to the notarized stamps, the recording dates with the county. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply let the facts sit where they fell. Cliff's lawyer rose and tried to reshape the story. He said Harold changed his mind toward the end. He said a father had the right to revise his plus. He suggested the trust was an overreach, unfair to a younger son who had every reason to expect equal treatment. His words moved across the room like smoke searching for a place to stick. The experts followed. A handwriting analyst set copies of Dad's genuine signatures next to the one on the new will. He spoke about pressure and stroke and lift, about how a hand in decline moves differently than a strong hand. Tracing old shapes. I watched him point with a capped pen, tracing lines on the projector screen. He said the new signature looked like it had been taken from an older document, copied carefully, not written fresh. Then came the hospital records, timelines, medication orders, entries showing when Dad was lucid and when he was not. Karen did not argue that every detail of the chart was perfect. She did not have to. The simple fact that Dad had been nearly unconscious on the day the new will claimed to have been signed sat heavy enough on its own. I glanced at Cliff only once while all this was happening. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, lips pressed thin as if listening to someone else's life being dissected. I could not read his eyes from where I sat. Maybe that was for the best. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and walked to the witness stand. The wood was smooth under my hand as I took the oath. My voice sounded strange in my own ears when I said my name for the record. Karen asked questions about my relationship with Dad, about the conversations we had in the months before he died, about the promise he had made regarding the house and the land. I answered with as few words as I could, letting the judge see whatever truth he could find in the spaces between them. Cliff's lawyer asked his own questions. He suggested that I might have misheard Dad, that grief might color memory, that I had a financial reason to see the will fall in my favor. I let him talk. When he pushed, I spoke about Dad as he was in those last weeks, how he struggled to hold a cup, how his signature on the old documents had grown slow and shaky. I did not attack. I did not defend more than necessary. I knew the judge was watching my face as much as he was listening to my words. After the testimony, there was a long moment where the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The judge shuffled papers, read notes, adjusted his glasses. He looked first at me, then at Cliff, and finally at the folder holding Dad's estate. He announced his decision without any real flourish. The new will was invalid. The signatures did not look genuine. The circumstances around it were too unsteady. The original will stood as the last clear expression of Harold's intent. The land trust was properly formed and remained in full effect. The house and the acreage passed to me as laid out years before. The gavel came down once, a short, solid sound, the kind you might miss if you were not listening. Cliff closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped as if someone had cut the strings holding him up. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, then let it fall. Across the aisle, Karen nodded once toward me, a small motion of acknowledgement. She had done her job. The law had done what it could with the pieces it was handed. Then the judge asked if I wished to pursue criminal charges. The words landed heavier than the gavel had. Fraud, attempted theft. They hung in the air between us, carrying more than legal weight. For a moment the room went quiet. I heard the faint creak of someone shifting on a bench behind me. I saw Cliff's fingers grip the edge of the table so tight his knuckles turned the color of paper. I imagined what would happen if I said yes. Mug shots, sentencing, a different kind of file labeled with our name. Dad's letter flashed through my mind. The line about fear, the way his hand had trembled on the page as he wrote that Cliff was in deep. The way he had trusted me not just to protect the land but to handle my brother when the time came. I heard Lauren's voice, too thin, over the phone that night, begging me to pull him back before he crossed a line he could not come back from. I cleared my throat. My voice sounded rough in the quiet room. I told the judge I did not wish to press criminal charges. I asked instead for court-ordered financial supervision for my brother and mandatory counseling. I said I wanted the will corrected, the land protected, and some structure in place to keep him from digging another hole this deep. The judge studied me for a long second, eyes narrowed slightly as if weighing more than just the request. Then he nodded. He said the court could order monitoring of Cliff's finances for a period of time and require proof of counseling as a condition of releasing certain assets. He made a note in the file. Beside me, I heard a sound that was almost a sob and almost a laugh. Cliff's shoulders shook. His face was turned down, but I could see tears slipping from the corner of his eyes, catching on his stubble. His lawyer handed him a tissue and looked at me over his head with a strange mix of respect and exhaustion. The hearing ended. People stood. Papers were shuffled into briefcases. The clerk called the next case. A different family. A different story. I walked out of the courtroom with the title to the house confirmed and the trust intact, the hallway lights buzzing faintly overhead. The folder felt heavier in my hand now that the fight was over. Karen said something about next steps and filings. Her words floated around me without landing. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, I paused and looked back once at the double doors. They swung shut behind another group of people, closing with a low, tired thud. Snow had started to fall again, thin flakes drifting down onto the stone. I stood there a moment longer, watching them melt as soon as they touched the wet patches on the stairs, then turned toward the street with the folder tucked close against my side. The courthouse steps were already warming under the late morning sun when I walked down to the lot. I could still hear the tension in the courtroom air, a faint echo that followed me like a shadow. The title papers sat folded in my jacket, but they felt heavier than any victory should. I opened the truck door and sat for a moment without starting the engine, letting the quiet settle across my shoulders. There was no satisfaction in what had happened, only a sense that something old had finally cracked open. The next weeks passed in a rhythm I had not expected. Under the judge's supervision, Cliff sold his Silverado and handed most of the money to the lender in Joplin. The debt that had been hanging over him like a storm cloud thinned a little. He moved into a small trailer on the edge of town, the kind that rattles in the wind and smells faintly of old carpet and cold metal. He found work with a concrete crew, hauling bags of mix and pushing wheelbarrows across job sites before dawn. Sometimes I drove past one of those sites and saw him with dust on his shoulders, moving slow but steady, the way a man rebuilds himself 1 hour at a time. I met him on Sunday evenings to go over a simple budget on my porch. I watched him study the numbers with a kind of careful fear, his brow tight as if one wrong move might send him backward. He never complained. He never asked for shortcuts. The judge had required counseling, and each week he showed me a signed slip from the therapist, folding it in half like it was something fragile. There was a quiet determination in him I had not seen before, a kind of tired courage that comes from having run out of excuses. One night he sat on the porch steps while the cicadas hummed in the trees and the heat of the day clung to the air. I went inside and brought out the folder holding the trust documents. When I handed them to him, he took them gently as if even the paper might judge him. He opened the top sheet and read the notarized dates, the signatures, the clauses that locked 120 acres away from danger long before he ever tried to claim them. His face went pale. He kept staring at the page, the porch light catching the tight pull of his jaw. After a long moment, he whispered that Dad had given up on him. His voice was so small I almost did not hear it. I sat beside him and told him Dad did not give up. He built a fence around the land the way a man builds a fence around something he hopes will outlast him. I said there was still room inside that fence if he chose to step through and stay there. He looked at his hands for a long time before he nodded, barely, like someone agreeing with a truth they are not ready to say out loud. Later that week, he came by in the evening. The sky was streaked with red and violet, the kind of Kansas sunset that paints everything in soft colors. Cliff held a small cedar bough. He said he found it buried in the bottom of one of Dad's old footlockers. Inside was a Polaroid from 1982 of the three of us standing by the workbench in the garage. Dad had his arms around our shoulders and we both looked young and sunburned, squinting at the camera. 2 folded letters lay beneath the photo. He handed me the one addressed in Dad's handwriting with my name on the front. I opened it slowly. Dad had written that I was the strong one. He said strength only mattered when used to steady someone else, and that he hoped I would remember that when the time came. The words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my throat tighten and had to blink to clear my eyes. Cliff unfolded his letter beside me at the kitchen table. He read silently. When he reached the last line, his breath caught. Dad had told him he forgave him long ago and that the hardest part would be forgiving himself. Cliff pressed the paper against his forehead and closed his eyes. I could see the weight of those words settle into him, not crushing him but grounding him like fresh concrete setting around rebar. We walked outside without saying much. The evening air held a faint smell of cut grass. The yard was quiet except for the rustle of the maples along the fence line. Cliff stood there with the letters in his hand, looking at the fading horizon as if he were trying to measure how far he had wandered from who he meant to be. I watched him shift his weight, shoulders drawn in, breathing slowly like someone trying to find steady ground. He stepped closer, and for a moment we just stood there in the half-light, 2 men who had spent years pulling away from each other without ever admitting it. Then he reached out and I did the same. The hug was awkward, our arms not quite sure where to go, but it held something old and unfinished. The sky above us turned a deeper blue and a light breeze moved across the yard, brushing against the porch rail and stirring the leaves. For a second, I could almost feel Dad standing beside us, hands on our backs, the way he used to do when breaking up a childhood fight. Neither of us said anything. The quiet was enough. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of the woods, and the porch light flickered once as if acknowledging the moment. When Cliff stepped back, he wiped his face with the heel of his hand and looked down at the letters pressed against his chest. I saw something in his expression that had not been there before, not relief exactly and not forgiveness, but the start of both, the fragile shape of a May learning to stand on his own feet again. We stayed in the yard until the last of the light drained from the sky. When he finally walked to his car, he paused by the open door and gave a small nod. It was not an apology and not a promise, but something in between. Something steady. I stood there with the porch behind me and the grass cool under my boots. The quiet settled around us again, soft and patient, as if the land itself was waiting for whatever came next. The quiet settled into the yard after Cliff drove off and the last echo of his engine faded into the dark fields. I stood there a little longer with the porch light humming above me, feeling the night wrap itself around the house in a way that did not feel lonely anymore. Inside, a floorboard shifted in the hallway, the soft creak drifting out like the house was stretching after too many years of holding its breath. I stepped through the doorway and let it close behind me, a small sound in a place that suddenly felt ready for something new. Over the next months, the house changed under my hands. I pulled rusted nails, lifted warped boards, patched places time had worn thin. The work was slow and steady and honest. I replaced cracked windows, planed the edges of swollen doors, rebuilt the porch rail that had sagged through 2 winters. Some evenings I found myself pausing in the middle of a task, listening to the wind push against the siding or the faint whistle of a train off Highway 83. The house felt different now, not as a burden I had to keep, but as something alive that was finally letting me carry it forward. Cliff began stopping by after work. He never called ahead. I would hear his boots on the path, slow and tired, and then see him come through the gate with a brush tucked in his back pocket or a rag draped over his shoulder. Concrete dust clung to his jeans. His hands were rougher than I remembered. He would nod once, pick up where he left off the day before, and fall into the rhythm of sanding or painting beside me. The silence between us was easy. He worked like a man trying not to disturb something fragile, as if each motion had to earn its place on the wood. One evening, Haley came home from community college. She stood beside me in the doorway, watching Cliff paint the fence with careful strokes. Her voice was soft when she said she had never seen him smile like that. She said it looked like the house was fixing him too. I looked at her then, at the way she held her arms loosely at her side, and I felt something shift inside me. For years I had carried the fear that my choices would turn her into someone who braced against the world, but standing there watching her watch him, I understood the land had a way of teaching gentleness if you let it. Winter loosened its grip. The mornings grew softer and the evenings held the scent of thawing earth. One foggy morning I opened the door and saw Cliff already on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. The fog wrapped around the trees, turning the timberline into a pale blur that moved like breath. I stepped beside him and we stood shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing for a while. The floorboards creaked under our boots. The sound was the same one I had heard all my life when Dad walked out to greet the day. For a moment it felt like an old rhythm had returned. Cliff spoke in a low voice. He said he had been thinking about selling the trailer once the debts eased and finding a place closer to steady work. He said he might try to talk to Lauren again slowly if she would hear him out. There was no desperation in his voice now, only a quiet hope he did not dare hold too tightly. I told him people change when they believe they can. He let out a long breath and nodded as if the morning air carried an answer he had been searching for. After he left for work, I stayed on the porch and thought about the cedar box sitting on my kitchen table. I opened it later that night and held the Polaroid again, the 3 of us in the garage, Dad's hands heavy on our shoulders, the sunlight hitting the concrete floor in wide bands. The letters were tucked beneath it. I read the one addressed to me once more. The words felt different now. Dad had written about strength and how it meant little unless used to steady someone else. I let the words settle in my chest. A warmth stirred under my ribs, not sharp like the past, but steady like a slow heartbeat. The days grew longer. Cliff kept coming. Some evenings we talked about small things like how the concrete crew was getting beat now that spring was coming. Some evenings he only worked in silence, his shoulders rising and falling with an even rhythm. The house began to stand straighter. The paint dried smooth under the sun. The fence line gleamed in the late afternoon light. Each fix brought a quiet relief, as if mending the wood helped mend something in both of us. One evening I walked the length of the porch when the sun was slipping behind the timber. The boards felt solid under my feet. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the faint scent of pine drifting from the woods. I heard a screen door creak open behind me and turned to see Haley leaning against the frame, watching the yard with a soft smile. She asked if Cliff would stay for dinner the next time he came by. I told her I thought he might. She nodded, then went back inside, leaving the door open long enough for the warm kitchen light to spill onto the porch. A few mornings later, the fog returned. It hung low along the ground, winding between the trees like slow-moving water. Cliff arrived while I was tightening a loose hinge on the front gate. He lifted a hand in greeting and stepped onto the porch with his usual quiet. We both held mugs of coffee, letting the steam drift into the cold air. The fog made the world smaller, gentler, as if the land wanted us to stand still long enough to understand something it had been trying to say. I watched the timberline gradually come into view as the fog lifted. The trees stood steady, their dark trunks rising from ground our family had worked for generations. I felt something loosen in me. It was not relief exactly, and not forgiveness, but something deeper. A release that left room for the days ahead. The kind a man feels when he understands he can set down what he has carried too long and still remain whole. Cliff took a slow breath beside me. We stood without speaking, letting the morning open at its own pace. The floorboards under us shifted again, a soft, familiar sound. A bird called from somewhere deep in the timber. The scent of damp earth drifted across the porch. I raised my coffee and let the warmth settle in my hands. The air felt calm, unhurried, the kind of morning that arrives without asking for anything. I stayed there with the fog thinning around us and the quiet moving gently through the air, letting the moment rest before the day began.